All right, we're ready to start the bias tape. That's what we're going to use to make our stems. Now I've set up here for with my piece of fabric. The pattern calls for you to cut, the first thing you do before you cut into your green fabric is to cut a chunk off that is about 15 inches wide by the width of the fabric, okay? I've cut my selvages off already, and I just wanted to point out to you that normally we as quilters, when we're cutting things, we'll leave it folded because our fabric comes folded at the halfway mark, and we've got our two selvages here toward us. We cut, and we can cut two of a shape at a time that way. But if we were to put our ruler on here and start cutting our bias this way with it folded, you can see that I'm going to get a couple long pieces, and then as I move my ruler up, I'm just going to end up getting shorter, 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 shorter. So even though I'm cutting two at a time, they're going to be too short. So whenever you're cutting bias, you want to open your fabric up and cut through a single layer. Okay? So bias just refers to the place in the fabric where you place your ruler. We have two grain lines in our fabric, the cross grain line and the lengthwise grain line and the crosswise grain line. And those are the way that the threads run in the fabric. And halfway between both of those, so 45 degrees between this 90-degree angle, we have the true bias. Anywhere along in that angle where we have between those two grain lines, our fabric is going to have more stretch. It has the very most stretch right at the 45 degree, and it still has stretch as we go along until we get toward the true grain, okay? So we want to use the area with the most stretch, so we're going to use a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to take my ruler and place it right on my fabric piece with the 45-degree line that's on your ruler. Every one of these long rulers has a 45-degree mark, okay? Place that 45-degree mark along the selvage edge, or where the selvage was. You can also use it if you place it along the side edge, 45 degrees right there, and you could cut this way. That will still give you a 45-degree angle, okay? So either grain line. Let me move these out of the way. And then I'm going to make the first cut. Oh, what did I do? Hang on, got to get a rotary cutter. I've got one here. Okay, I make my first cut, and now I have a bias cut. Now what I like to do, this piece is going to be smaller. It's going to have smaller pieces, so I'm going to save this to use for smaller pieces of applique. So I will set this aside, and I'm going to take this piece now, and I turn this so that I can use my ruler to measure against that cut edge as I go, and I'm going to cut as I go down. Sometimes you're cutting a piece that maybe I had you start with a piece that was 24 inches wide. So when you turn it this way, it doesn't fit on your cutting mat. In that case, fold this against itself so you have the edge even, and you can cut measuring against that as you go. And that way you can fit the whole piece on your mat, okay? So it doesn't have to be straight on your mat because we're going to use our ruler to measure. And these pieces that we're called for today are going to be 5/8 inch wide. Now I want to tell you why they're 5/8 of an inch wide. We're going to use a bias tape maker. Here's one right here. This is the 1/4 inch wide bias tape maker. They come in many sizes. There's a 3/8, a 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch. I've even seen a 2 inch one. So the 1/4 inch is the smallest one I've seen, and I like to use the 1/4 inch when I have a lot of curve because it curves easier. The wider the bias, the harder it is going to be to make a tight curve, okay? So I'm using the 1/4 inch today, and the instructions in your bias tape maker are not always exactly correct. So I want to tell you what I do, and this is what works really well. I cut my strips double the finished size plus an extra 1/8 of an inch. Now, I think that the instructions call for you to cut your strips 1/2 inch wide, which would be double, because we're doing 1/4 inch. I add that extra 1/8 of an inch because it allows enough fabric to make that fold. As we've been learning with our precision piecing through this whole class, it takes a little bit of fabric to make those folds, and you'll be a little bit more successful if you cut your strips wider. So don't read the instructions, just do what I say. You'll love it. Okay, so we've got 5/8 of an inch, and it's a scant 5/8. It's not, I don't put my mark right up on top of the fabric like I normally do. I've got it to the side. It's just a scant 5/8, and I'm going to cut these strips. And I think the pattern calls for you to cut 24 or 30 of them, something like that. It's a generous amount. You probably don't need every one of them. It's, you know, sometimes our patterns, we give you enough so that you have plenty if you make a mistake. So 5/8 inch. I'm going to cut 3 or 4 of them. I have to move the bias tape so that I can see where the edge of my fabric is, so you can see too. Okay, and as I get going along, I will have to shift my fabric down closer and closer until I get there. So anyway, that allows me to cut a lot of long strips out of that chunk of fabric. Now I've got 3 of them cut here, so let's get ready to pass them through our bias tape maker. Let me move this out of the way. We go to our ironing surface now, and first thing I'm going to do, and this is another thing that is not told to you by the instructions of the bias tape maker. I'm going to fold these so that they fit onto my ironing board. At home, I just put them on my ironing board, which is long, and lay them all out. And I usually do 2 or 3 at a time. And big important step is spray them with spray starch. Okay? Now I've got extra starch around here, so I'm going to kind of wipe it up. I want them to be a little bit moist, okay? Now, if you were to spray them after you pass them through the bias tape maker, the moisture would just unfold it. So we have to spray them first, and it makes a difference in how these turn out. I've now pressed just one end, about an inch, to just dry that little bit of starch that's on the end so that it'll feed through easily. I set the bias tape maker on my ironing surface with the colored side up, okay? And I'm going to place the end of the fabric into the bias tape maker in the back, right in that slot. Can you see that? Now I've got the wrong side facing up, and I'm just sliding it in. Now I'm going to turn it over because there's a slot on this side, and I can take a pin or an awl and just slide the fabric down and advance it until it comes out the tip. Okay, there we go. Then I pin it into my ironing board so that I don't pull it when I pull it along. Stick my iron right there and just pull this along. And in fact, I don't usually pull it. I usually just push it with my iron. And I want to leave my iron in place long enough for that starch to completely dry. And I'm off the edge of my ironing surface, so I'm going to slide this forward, pin it again. I'm going to back up my bias tape maker because that wasn't quite dry yet. Want to make sure I leave my iron there long enough for that to dry. Let me point out one other thing to you. When you buy a bias tape maker, this one is called a fusible bias tape maker. Interruption here, I have to show you. There's the finished bias tape. Isn't that great? The edges are turned, nice crisp edges, and it's ready to use. What I was saying is that this is called a fusible bias tape maker. It has a little slot right here, and the instructions will tell you to put the fusible tape that you buy separately into that little slot and slide it down, and then you attach it as you're pressing it. You attach the fusy tape to your bias. I don't like using the fusy tape because it doesn't allow me to shape my vine, because it doesn't, once the tape's on it, it can't bend and shape. So I don't use the fusy part. So even though it says it's a fusible bias tape maker, I just use it for the folding part, and I don't use the fusy part. Okay, now my bias tape is already formed, and I just want to show you what this can do. Now at this point, I'm going to turn the starch back on. The steam. Wouldn't it be great if our irons had a little starch dispenser? No, it's steam. I've got my steam turned back on because I'm going to use my iron to shape my bias tape. And because it has starch in it, the starch is going to keep the fabric rigid. That's what it does. But if I put a little shot of steam in it as I'm trying to shape it, it's going to moisten that starch and release it and let it shape into a different shape. So let's try making a little curve. How about an S curve? I did a little bit of steam. Boy, I'm on the starch kick, aren't I? Okay. So see how I can shape that any shape I want? And if I pick it up, because I have starch in it, take it over to my quilt where I'm ready to apply it, it's going to retain that shape. Isn't that awesome? So bias tape with this method is one of the easiest things that I do in applique. And everyone looks at it and says, oh, that looks so hard. And that really is the easiest thing, and it fills up a lot of space. If you have a big wide border, it's easy to make a nice big curve and then put a few leaves, and wow, that space is filled up. And it really makes a difference. So of course we're going to shape ours to make the project that we're doing, but I just wanted to show you how you can make bias tape work for you. So let's make a couple more. Oh, there they are. I was going to say, where did those go? I know I cut some. So the first thing I did, remember, is to press the end that was moist so that it dries out. Take my bias tape maker and with the wrong side of the strip up, feed it into the bottom of it, turn it over, slide the fabric down. When it comes out the end, pin it into your ironing board and just press. Easiest thing ever. Every once in a while, you have to check to make sure that your bias tape maker is right in the middle, that your fabric isn't bunched up on one side or the other side. I'm going to leave my iron there long enough for that to dry. And then slide this down. I know you can't see, but I'm going to move the iron in a second here. There you go. Okay. And then just keep, and I found that if you get too far ahead of your iron when you're pulling it along, it allows the edges to kind of open up and your bias tape will be a little wider and ends up being kind of a little wonky, skinny wide. So I just push the thing along with my iron, and then it's very consistent in width. So there's one piece we'll set aside. And let's do one more. By now you're a pro, I know. And these couple little things that I've told you are what are going to make the difference for you. I know so many people when I go and teach this in classes have said, I have a bias tape maker, I've had it for years, but I've never used it, or I don't know how to use it, or I tried it and it didn't work. The big things, boy, I can't even pick that pin up. The big things are cut your strip, add yourself 1/8 of an inch extra, and the other thing is use spray starch. That's going to, you know, keep your edges turned under nice and crisp. Hello, of course I can't get this out because you're watching. There we go. Okay, stick my iron in here. Now, as I said, they do come in a lot of different sizes, so let's go over the strip width that you're going to cut. If you're going to cut for the 1/4 inch bias tape maker, we doubled the 1/4 inch, the finished size, to 1/2 inch, added our extra 1/8 of an inch, came up with 5/8. If you were doing using a 1/2 inch bias tape maker, you would double that to an inch. 1/2 inch doubled is an inch, and your extra 1/8 inch. So you're going to cut your strips 1 1/8. If you use the 3/8 inch bias tape maker, double 3/8 is 3/4. Add an extra 1/8, you're going to have 7/8 of an inch. So no matter what size, doesn't matter how big the bias tape maker is, you only add an extra 1/8. That's just to allow enough to make the folds come up over. So I've got a couple pieces of bias tape here ready to go, and let's slide this out of the way and refer to our placement diagram. Let me get that out now. We're going to work on, like I said, that one block that I had pulled out here for you. The center block that's in the center of our quilt. I've taken my placement diagram from the pattern and copied it with a Sharpie marker so it's nice and dark. And there's several ways you can do this. I like doing this because I can see it through my fabric. Sometimes when the fabric's dark like this, you'll have to use a different method. This works really well, or maybe you could use a light box. But I want to show you what I usually do, and that's what I usually do, is darken my placement diagram. Okay, and the pattern calls for me to cut some pieces that are 4 inches long. So I'm just going to cut off the edges. 1, 2, 3, 4. And these don't have to be perfect. That's just giving us a general idea. And then, oh, that's all we need for this block. Where I was doing another block. Okay, got ahead of myself. Okay. Now these are these pieces. One is the stem, and one is each of these side things, but you can see that these little side things aren't curved yet. So we've got those ready to go. Let's curve them. Now you can use your placement diagram directly, which is a great way to do it because then you know you're going to be exact. I stick my bias tape right on there, get a little bit of steam, don't burn yourself, and now that's exactly the shape I need it to be. It came undone a little, so I need to tighten that curve a tiny bit. So you can see now that I've got that exactly how I want it. It's a tiny bit, I'm gonna zap it one more time so I can get exactly the shape I want. I want to leave it there long enough for that starch to dry in place. Okay, and then I would do the same thing on the other side, which actually is the very same curve that's on this side. I could have used the same curve. It would work fine. Okay, I've got my two curved pieces, and I'm going to put my block right on top of my placement diagram. Now my placement diagram shows the finished size, so I'm going to put my block 1/4 inch over. I don't know if you can actually see this because it's hard for me even to see. I can see it if I push the fabric down. I don't know if you can see through it, but this is a good way to get an exact placement so that you can duplicate. If you can't see through your fabric and you can eyeball that. I know for a fact that I've got one stem coming straight up, and then I would create one of the arches, and then I'll show you a method in a second here how to make the second one exactly the same. But let me just lay out these pieces, show you how this is going to go together. Now, you'll wonder, what do we do at the edges? Do you see where this stem ends right down here in the bottom of the block? Normally, when I have a bottom of a stem, it usually ends where there's a seam line, and I like to unpick that seam line and stick the end of the bias tape down into the seam and then just sew it closed, or maybe even the quilter will close it when she's quilting it. But because this seam doesn't go all the way across, see, I've got a diagonal seam here against this, so that doesn't work for this one. So I'm going to just fold the end under, place it against exactly where I want it, and have it go right there. Sometimes when you fold that end under, let me show you, I'll show you right here so you can see. You'll get a little extra fabric sticking out on the sides, and it's kind of a lot of fabric because you have 2 layers here and 2 layers there because of the folds. So what I like to do, where'd my scissors go? Here we go. I open up that fold and just trim off in an angle. Let me show you right here. I just trimmed off a little bit of the fold because I don't need the folds. And see, when I've got it closed, it looks like a Y. I don't know if you can see that. But basically, I'm just trimming some of the fabric away so that it's not so bulky. And then I'll have that folded. Then that's going to be here. This piece is going here, and it's going to go underneath that, but I'm going to cut this end so that it's on an angle so that I can stick it underneath. Same thing on this side. That's going to go there. And let's get some of our pieces from before. That's our A block. Now remember, we had those flags sticking out on these pieces that we prepared. Just leave those sticking out. We don't want to cut those off, remember? Okay. As you're placing this, especially if you're eyeballing it, because on the placement diagram we have enough room to allow for the seam allowance. But if you're eyeballing it, make sure you don't place anything into that seam allowance. You've got to have plenty of room to back it off so that you're away from the 1/4 inch seam allowance so that you can sew this into your quilt. Actually, in reality, you're probably working on blocks that are already sewn together, so you'll be fine because you're working on your center block that's already put together, and your outside border blocks we've already sewn into the border, even though they're not sewn, may not be sewn to the quilt. So you probably don't have to worry about that seam allowance. Just keep that in mind. Okay. Now I've got my pieces ready, and I'm ready to glue these down. Now here's where we get to the good part. This is Apple Glue, which is a Jalili Studio product. I've developed this. It's an acid-free, pH neutral adhesive that is perfect for basting your quilt pieces in place. It's designed specifically for fabrics. The formula is safe to leave in your quilt if you want to. If you want it to wash out, it is water soluble. It doesn't come out, I will tell you, it doesn't come out real readily. I wouldn't be smashing it all over your quilt because it does kind of get caught in the fibers, so you kind of have to pick it out. But it is a water-based product, okay? But it's very important that you have an archival product that you're using on fabrics, because over time, if you have an acid base or even an alkaline product, it's going to damage your fibers in your quilt and change them. You could change the dye's color and things like that. So it's important to have an archival quality product. All right, Apple Glue comes with a little tip that's on here, little tip cover, and you just unscrew that. And then in this little baggie that is tied on it, there's the precision tip that we use to dispense the glue. And it's this little pink tip. And it just screws onto the top of the bottle. And then there's a red cap to cover it so that it doesn't dry out. It's an air dry product, so it's supposed to dry out. If you leave the cap off of it, it will dry out. That's what it's supposed to do. You want it to dry or it wouldn't work, right? So make sure you keep your cap on. Now I want to point out something about this that is great. Because it's got a teeny tiny little tip, let me show you. Let me grab a little piece of fabric here so I can show you. It allows you to put just the tiniest drop of glue in the seam allowance of your prepared pieces. You can do a line of glue if you prefer to do that, or dots. And I use a dot usually about every 1/2 inch to inch. And because it's such a precision tip, you just use a teeny bit, but it's very tacky. It's going to hold in place really well. And because the tip is narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, it's tapered, it allows air up into the tip so it doesn't create a vacuum where some of those straight cylinder tips do, and then you get glue caught in there and it's always clogged. So this tip won't clog. When I'm done using it, I'll tap it and let the glue drain back down into the bottle. Keep the lid on and you're going to have no problems with clogging. After you're done using it one session, I unscrew the tip, go rinse it out with water, and that way I won't ever have any dried glue in there. Of course, like I said, it is an air dry product, and if you've got dried glue in there, you can just get a pin and pull the dry glue out and then wash it and get going. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to put a little drop of glue right here to hold that fold that's in the bias tape on the bottom of the stem. So I'm just going to fold that. It doesn't have to have everything tucked under because we're going to tuck under the flags and anything that sticks out with our needle, and I'm going to show you that when we stitch. And then I've got that placed right there, and I'm just going to eyeball this because this is a pretty basic simple block, right? I've got a few dots of glue where they shouldn't be, but that's okay. I'll just take those off, okay? And a couple dots here. See, I'm putting the dots of glue in the center of the bias strip, about 1 inch or 1/2 inch apart. There we go. It's nice to keep your glue away from your folded edge because that's where you're going to be stitching, and it's easier to stitch without the glue in the way. You can stitch through the glue, it's just not as smooth. Okay, this end, there we go. And then these guys, this is a unit, so I think I'm going to glue these pieces together before I put the whole thing down. I'm trying to decide if that's a good idea. I think that's not a brilliant, oh, maybe it's okay. I'm going to put a few dots of glue here and glue it to this center of the flower. Same thing on this side. I'm just hoping I don't make my flower too wide to fit. Oh, it's great. There we go. Okay, so now when I'm putting my glue, I want you to notice that I'm not putting any near any flags. I don't want any glue gluing that down, okay? So I stay away from the flag. About every 1/2 inch to inch, a dot of glue goes into the seam allowance, right in the center of the seam allowance. I don't want glue on a single layer of fabric because it will show up through the fabric and it will kind of attach your applique piece from the center, and you only want the edges to be attached, the seam allowances, and I will show you why. Because, let's glue that down, and the glue is really sticky, it's going to hold immediately. Oh, we forgot our little leaf. Got a leaf that goes on the bottom. Put it over here so you can see. And let me refer to my diagram. That goes right here. Yeah, there we go. And I didn't make two of those, but I would make another one to go on the other side. So I have all the pieces glued down at once, and I like to do that because then I don't spend any time stitching down any parts that are underneath another piece, so I don't have to waste time. And I also, like I said, it makes it completely portable, and I can take this with me if I go to the doctor's office or something like that, soccer game or whatever, watching the grandkids. Then I can easily pull this out. All I need with me is my needle and thread, and I can just be stitching. And we'll get to that stitching part, but I wanted to point out how easy that is to glue baste everything in place. And I wanted to show you, if you're going to eyeball these blocks and you want them to be uniform, here's a good way to shape this piece. Let's say I put the first piece down and I want a mirror image piece over here, but I want to make sure that I have the exact same curve. So what I'm going to do to shape that is I'm going to put my bias tape strip on there upside down. Okay, so I'm going to press them, put them on each other, right sides together. Let me just cut this one off because then I don't have to work with the whole thing. Put it on there, right sides together. So I've got the folded side up facing me, and I'm going to shape this piece to be the same shape, if I can get my iron to turn on, as the piece that's underneath it. And I'll give it a shot of steam. And you can press the glue if you want to. If you want to make it dry faster, honestly, it dries pretty quick anyway, so you don't really need to. Either way. So now you can see that I have the exact same shape to place over here that's a mirror image of the shape that I had there. That's one way to make sure that as you're making these curves, you make sure they're the same by placing another piece that's going to be the mirror image on top of that piece that you previously placed, and it will be exactly the same shape, exactly the same curve, so they're going to come out even. Okay, our pieces are all glued down on this block. I would go around this block and glue down all the rest of the pieces. Notice in your pattern that you're going to use different, let me just pull this out, different colors of fabric for the different flowers. So you've got the red version here in the blue block, and here in the pink block you use blue flowers, and then in the outside corners you use red flowers again. And we don't have the yo-yos done that go on the ends, and we're going to talk about that next. So let me show you that.